of skills. We have a sequence of skills that is taught in a particular order, and one builds on the one before it that proceeds in manageable steps. So one isn't a whole lot more difficult than the ones before it. So making your instruction systematic, in addition to being explicit, is really important. So those are some of the probably the two most important features overall of effective instruction, but there's some components that make those things work better. And the first one of those is opportunities to respond. So I want to tell you a little bit about what an opportunity to respond is. You can define it as any teacher request, direction, or question, anything that you say that prompts your students to respond. Because every time they respond, what they're doing is practicing. And you want them to practice, 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 because that's how they get proficient or automatic with their skills. We know that some kids will pick up a new word or a new grapheme phoneme correspondence with just very few exposures, 1 to 4 exposures. You also probably know kids who require a lot more exposures before they hold on to a word or a grapheme phoneme correspondence. And when we're thinking about how to ensure that all kids are getting it, we need to think about how much practice each child needs and how much practice they're getting. So here are just a few examples of opportunities to respond during a foundational skills lesson. So if I say, repeat this sound, okay, and I give you a sound, I ask you to repeat it, that's an opportunity for you to respond. What sound does this letter spell? Read this word, spell this word, let's count the sounds in this word. All of those are opportunities for you to respond or to practice the skill that we're working on. The research on opportunities to respond is extremely powerful. We know that increasing opportunities to respond increases kids' on-task behaviors, their student engagement, and most important, their learning. So the more practice, the better behaved they're going to be, the more engaged they're going to be, and they're going to be learning more. If you think about the things that you have learned, the skills that you've learned, you probably know how to drive. You might have learned how to play an instrument. You might have learned how to play a sport. Anything that you learn, any skill that you've developed in your life, you probably learned it by practicing it. And the more you practice, the better that you get at it. I can drive with a lot of automaticity. In fact, sometimes I will be thinking about other things so much that I'll arrive someplace and not even really remember getting there. Because my driving is just so automatic for me. I don't have to think about turning on the blinker or stepping on the gas versus the brake. I just do those things without thinking. Now, if driving conditions change, if maybe there's a bad thunderstorm or there's a lot of traffic, at that point, driving may not be as automatic for me. And so when it starts to rain, I might, if I'm talking with somebody on my phone, I might say, I gotta go, I gotta turn off, gotta hang up the phone. Or if I'm listening to the radio, I might turn it down because I've got to focus more on one thing because my cognitive effort is now challenged. If it's under normal conditions, then I don't have to do that. And the same thing happens with kids with reading. If they're reading about familiar topics, they might get to the point where they're very fluent, very automatic, and don't have to think really hard about what they're reading. But if they're reading about something they've never read before, or they're encountering a lot of words they've never seen before, then they have to focus at a different level. And if you don't build skills to the point of automaticity, then that's what they're going to have to do. I took piano lessons when I was a child, but I took piano lessons for about 6 months before I gave up on it. I am nowhere close to being automatic with playing the piano. I probably can't play anything at the point of automaticity because I did not get enough practice. When we talk about practice, really all practice is not the same. So I want to talk a little bit about the different types of practice and what cognitive psychology tells us about them. So 2 ways that we can categorize practice are blocked practice and interleaved practice. So when I'm talking about blocked practice, I mean introducing a skill practice, practice, practice until you master that skill. Once you've mastered that skill, you move on to another skill. Practice, practice, practice it until you master it and move on to another skill. An example of blocked practice is the traditional spelling list. You pass out the list of words on Monday, you introduce them to kids, they practice them all week, they write them 5 times each, put them in sentences, blah, blah, blah. And then on Friday, you give them a test on that list and they get 100%. Yay, right? Except if you come back in 6 weeks and give them that same test with those same words again, probably half the kids will now get a 50%, not 100%, because that kind of practice doesn't lead to retention. Interleaved practice is very different. In interleaved practice, you introduce a skill, you don't master it typically. Some kids might, but most kids are not going to master it with just a little bit of practice. But then you introduce another skill and another skill, but you keep coming back and practicing those same skills over time. And interleaving them, meaning that you put a skill in between the practice sessions of another skill. And what cognitive psychology research has shown us is that interleaved practice is actually more effective than block practice at producing long-term retention of skills. This is especially true if the skills that you're practicing are closely related, because one of the things that you're doing when you're interleaving is you're really paying attention to telling the difference between the things that you're practicing. And that extra added attention that's required to do that is part of what is thought to lead to that long-term retention. So overall, when we're talking about foundational reading skills, interleaved practice is going to be more powerful than block practice at getting kids to hold on to those skills. So this is a lesson from our reading program, our phonics program. And in this lesson, this one is the lesson where the short I sound is introduced. So the short I is linked with the letter I, so that I and the letter I are connected. That's the grapheme phoneme correspondence that we want kids to learn. And in this particular lesson, kids practice it in isolation, they practice it in words, they practice it in sentences, they practice it in a passage. And over the course of that lesson, that connection between the letter I and the sound I is practiced 41 times. So lots and lots of practice. But it doesn't end there. In the very next lesson, the focus of the lesson has shifted to the letter N representing the sound N. But the letter I representing I is practiced 59 times in the N lesson. It's practiced 64 more times in the lesson that reviews consonant vowel consonant patterns. Over time, that connection between the grapheme I and the phoneme I is practiced over and over and over in all of these other lessons, to the point where they have it over 10 lessons, they'll have 338 times to make that connection. That much practice over time, when you're still learning new skills, that interleaved practice is likely to lead to long-term retention. And that's our goal. However, when we think about opportunities to respond, we need to think about the kind of practice that we're doing. We've all heard the saying, practice makes perfect, but I believe it's Anita Archer that tells us no, practice doesn't make perfect. Practice makes permanent. And what that means is when we practice something, we're going to hold on to it. And if we practice something correct, we're going to hold on to the correct thing. And that might be perfect. But if we practice something incorrect, we're going to hold on to the incorrect thing. So practicing incorrectly leads to problems. So one of the things that we want to make sure we're doing during that practice is really paying attention to the kind of practice that's happening. Is it correct or is it incorrect? And we need to provide high quality feedback. And the basic things that we're going to focus on are behavior specific praise or corrective feedback. So here's kind of the sequence of events. There's an opportunity to respond, the student responds, the teacher monitors that response, and then the teacher provides feedback. And the feedback is either going to be behavior-specific praise to encourage more of that same response, or corrective feedback to encourage a different response. So those are our two types of feedback. So let's talk a little bit more about what each one of those things means. So behavior-specific praise, we can think of as any verbal statement, anything the teacher says that communicates positive feedback to a student, but also explicitly identifies what they did well, what was correct about their response. So it's not good job, yay. We're naming specifically what was good. So we might say, nice job following directions the first time. That would be behavior-specific praise about a non-academic behavior versus great job saying the ooh sound in cool, right? That would be an academic type of response that we're providing behavior-specific praise to. Awesome work blending those sounds, good thinking to try a different vowel sound in that word. Corrective feedback is noticing when the student's response is incorrect and then providing specific, brief, and immediate correction. So one of the key features of good corrective feedback is that we're sure to include some sort of prompt within it that elicits the correct response. So we don't want to just say, no, that was wrong. We want to say, here's the right answer. What is that right answer? And getting them to reply. So some examples of this, let's say your student, you have the word ship and the child reads it as chip. So a ch sound instead of a sh sound. So corrective feedback there would be pointing to the SH grapheme and saying, this is the grapheme SH. SH spells sh. What does SH spell? And then the student responds. So you're telling them, you're not saying, no, it's not CH. You don't see a CH there, do you? You're not berating them for getting it wrong. You're pointing out what the correct response is. So it's corrective feedback. I'm helping them get the correct response. And these are some other examples of corrective feedback. So the idea here for corrective feedback is I model the correct response. And if I'm working with a group of students, we're going to do some guided practice where I guide all the students in saying the correct response. And then I ask them to do it individually. So everyone does their own correct response. So for example, if I am teaching grapheme phoneme correspondences, I might do a visual drill where I just show them letters that they've recognized before, that they've learned before, and I want them to tell me what sound that letter is representing. And let's say instead of saying ah for this, they say I. Obviously, I is not the sound that goes with this letter. So I would then model the correct response. A spells ah. Say it with me. So we do, and you do it with me and say A spells ah. And then I'm going to ask you to do it, your turn. And so that elicited the correct response as I'm providing that corrective feedback. For blending a word, if the child mispronounces the word, maybe they say wick instead of quick, I can say that word is quick, quick. Say it with me, quick, quick. Your turn. Okay, same thing. Blending a word together, that word is flash, flash. Say it with me, right? So the idea is I'm providing corrective feedback, making sure that I've elicited your correct response in the process. So effective instruction, we've determined is explicit, it's systematic, it provides plentiful opportunities to respond, and those responses are then monitored to make sure that you provide either behavior-specific praise or corrective feedback. But let's think for a minute about effective intervention. So for kids who are struggling, we need to provide intervention. And effective intervention is all of the same things that effective instruction is. It's explicit, it's systematic, with ample opportunities to respond and appropriate feedback. However, intervention has one more characteristic that distinguishes it from instruction. Intervention is also intensive. And when I say intensive, what I'm referring to is I'm working with smaller groups or maybe even individuals. I have more opportunities for more targeted practice, and I spend more time, a longer duration of instruction. Those are the ways that we most often make our instruction more intensive. So in thinking about this, maybe across a multi-tiered system of support, in tier 1, we know we're going to be providing explicit instruction that includes an I do, a we do, and a you do. But because we know that practice is really important, we're going to include a little bit more than typical. And because I live in the South, we're going to make a little bit of that a y'all do. So I do it as I'm going to do it myself to model or demonstrate. We do it as we're all going to do it together. Y'all do it means I'm going to put you in pairs or in small groups to practice. And then you do it as you do it all by yourself. For tier 2, we're going to just do more of all of those things. And for tier 3, even more of all those things. The main thing that makes an intervention different from instruction is the amount of opportunities to respond. The more practice that students get, the more intense the instruction is, and the more likely they are to retain what you're teaching them. So effective intervention is intensive. That also means that we want to have the most skilled person providing the intervention. So the person who can do it all, that's the person that we want providing the more intensive intervention. Very often I'll go in classrooms and see a child who's struggling over here in the corner with the volunteer that showed up that day. Or maybe a paraprofessional that doesn't have the same level of training as the teacher. And that really doesn't make any sense. That's the equivalent of you arriving at the hospital with a particularly challenging medical issue, and they say, oh, we better call the lady from the flower shop to help you, right? That makes no sense at all. You want the specialist, and the child who's struggling deserves the specialist. And that's typically the classroom teacher, not the volunteer. So effective intervention is all the things effective instruction is, except it's also more intensive, so you have more opportunities for practice. So again, we're focusing on developing automaticity. So let's talk about these different elements, words, GPCs, words, and text. When we're talking about providing practice for GPCs, one of the things we're doing is helping kids connect the grapheme and the phoneme. So we can do that with a visual drill where we're presenting the grapheme and asking students to practice that connection by producing the phoneme. So they can say CK spells K, FF spells F, and so on. We can do that the opposite direction and provide the phoneme and ask the students to produce the grapheme. So if I say K, students who have learned multiple graphemes for that phoneme might say K is spelled C or K or CK, and they're going to write each one of those. So in the example here, the teacher said oi, and the students spelled it OI and OY. For practicing words, we can do a blending drill where we're spelling words and we're asking kids to read those words. We change one element of the word and ask them to read the new word. We change another element of the word, ask them to read the new word, and so on. So this idea is there's a pretty rapid, quick progression through a series of words that they're practicing blending. We can also do practice with manipulative letters that allows kids to both blend and, to both decode and encode the word. So decoding is blending the sounds, and encoding is segmenting the sounds to spell. So if I'm doing this with a word chain, I can say start with a word, and in this case, begin with the word mat, change mat to sat. I'm telling you what word, I'm asking you to spell the word. So what would you need to do to change mat to sat? You need to take away the M and replace it with an S. I can say change the S to an F. Now, what word do you have? Now I've told you how to spell the word, and I'm asking you to read it or to decode it. Change fat to fit. I'm asking you to spell it or encode it. Change the F to an S, or I could say change the F to a S. What word is that? I'm asking you to decode. And going back and forth is a really powerful way to get kids to practice both skills that they need. So the idea here is that any kind of encoding practice is asking kids to spell. And when I tell you how to spell it and then ask you to read your new word or to tell me what word you have, that's decoding practice. So here's an example. If I start with shin, make the word shin, right? That was spelling. I encoded that word. Now, if I said change the n to a p, what word is this? Well, let's change the n to a p. What word is it? Means I'm reading it or decoding it. If I then say change ship to shop, I'd have to figure out, what do I need to change about that word? Well, I don't need an I in shop. I need an O in shop. So I have spelled it or encoded that word. Then I could say change P to CK. Let's change that P to a CK. What word did we spell? Shock. Okay, so I'm having to read or to decode the word. So that alternating encoding and decoding practice with word chains is a really powerful way to practice our basic foundational skill of reading words. We can also do practice reading and spelling irregular words. So you're probably familiar with the concept of the heart word method. This idea is that we are helping kids recognize which part of the word doesn't follow the expected grapheme phoneme correspondence. That part of the word that doesn't follow the grapheme phoneme correspondence we expect is the part of the word that we need to learn by heart. The rest of the word we can decode just like any other word. And so practicing writing irregular words and reading irregular words frequently and remembering which part is the part we need to learn by heart is how we become automatic with reading and spelling irregular words. We also want to make sure that some of our practice is with connected text, and connected text can be sentences or it can be passages or books. So again, you want to do both reading and spelling, both decoding and encoding words. So you can read sentences, you can spell sentences, and then you can also read passages. So one of the things that we have on the toolbox that I mentioned earlier is at ufliteracy.org. You can find decodable passages. The decodable passages align to the scope and sequence that I mentioned earlier, which is also available on the website. And the idea here is that these get more complex as you move down the lessons into the more complex lessons. And these passages are they are decodable in that they only use, for the most part, grapheme phoneme correspondences that kids have been exposed to in the scope and sequence. There are also irregular words that are taught in our scope and sequence that are included, but for the most part, these are all at least 90% decodable, which is a very high decodability level. We also didn't include a picture. We asked kids to illustrate the picture as a way to check their comprehension. So some of these are a little bit thin in terms of a plot. I sit, I tap, I sit, and I tap. But very quickly, you get into kind of interesting stories, and the kids love illustrating them. Here are a few illustrations. So some of the other ways that teachers practiced with this connected text, they had kids identify the particular grapheme phoneme correspondence that they, or in some cases, the morphemes that they were taught in the lessons, and they highlighted those examples. Then they had the kids illustrate, and that gives you a way to see, are they understanding what they're reading? In a couple of cases, we see on the one on the left, this little boy did a beginning, middle, and end, kind of a comic strip sequence to tell the story, what happened in each part of the story. That was a little bit more advanced comprehension skill. On the right, the teacher asked the kids to label the different parts of what they had drawn, aligning with the story. So some of the things to think about as you are supporting students efficient practice, you want to review and reinforce their behavioral expectations and their instructional routines. So the more efficient your instruction is, the less time you have to spend getting out materials or getting kids to move from one place to another, the more efficient you can be, the more practice you can get in. And just like our academic skills, we can respond to students' their response to your behavioral expectations with behavior-specific praise or corrective feedback, their response to your routines with behavior-specific praise or corrective feedback. So some behavioral expectations that can help speed up lessons in order to get more practice in. You want your students to follow directions the first time, listen to the directions, stay in their learning space where they're supposed to be, always try hard. Those are things that you can identify at the beginning of a lesson to remind kids what they're expected to do. Some of the instructional routines you want to think about are how you make transitions, whether it's from one activity to another, one space to another, your management of materials, the students' management of materials, how quickly they get them out, take them away, use them effectively, and ways they respond to your instruction. So for instructional routines, like doing things like moving from a table to the carpet and then moving back to the table when the carpet activity is done, that's something that can waste a lot of time. And if you're not doing it efficiently, then it's going to take away time that could be better spent practicing the skills that you want them to learn. So having a method in practicing, that's a good thing to do at the beginning of the year, get those transitions down so kids know exactly what's expected. When it's time to move, stand up, push in your chair, get to your spot on the carpet, let's go. And you can count down. And you get there, 3, 2, 1, and everybody's in their spot. You're mostly just communicating, this isn't time to lollygag, right? It's time to get where you're supposed to be and get started doing what you're supposed to be doing. As far as materials, making sure that your students know which materials they need for which activity, that they know where those materials are kept, how to get them out, how to get them ready to use, how to put them away effectively. How you organize your materials can really make a difference. If you've got a system that kids know where these things are and where to go get them, that can make a big difference in effective use of materials. Some teachers really go hog wild with this, color coding things. I love the kinds of examples that teachers share with us. I was in the classroom on the right where each student group had their own set of materials, and each day one student's job was to be the manager of materials, and they all knew what to do when it was their turn. They knew which materials they needed for each step of the lesson. They got them passed out quickly. It was one of the most efficient classrooms I've ever been in. Instructional responses are another way to increase efficiency to allow more time for practice. Knowing how you're responding using a whiteboard. Are you doing a choral response or an echo response? I say it and then you say it. Am I going to gesture when I want your response? My turn, I can point to me. Your turn, I can point to you. When you're ready, give me a thumbs up. Having these instructional routines for responses can make your instruction much more efficient, leave you lots more time for practice. Holding up a response so that the teacher can see is a really powerful way. Getting kids in the routine where they know how to respond quickly and effectively.
But if I have more than one, I now have drop the Y and I.
Getting kids to learn how to come in chorally for it. Learning how to do whatever you've asked them to do and then show you that they've done it. Helps kids keep engaged, keeps them on task, and keeps them accountable that they're actually doing what you've asked. Getting the response when they finished, giving you the thumbs up that they're ready to move on. one of the things that helps a lot with making sure you have a lot of opportunity to practice is the kind of pacing that you're using. And this can be pacing within lessons, that you're moving quickly and not wasting time. It can also mean that you're pacing across lessons. One of the things that we tend to want to do as teachers is, when we know that a child is struggling, we want to slow things down for them. Maybe we're moving too fast for them. And that's a problem, because what happens is, over time, when we slow things down for the kids who are struggling, we're actually widening the gap. They're going to fall further behind. What we want to do is to keep them at least at the same pace as their peers, so that the gap doesn't widen. But even better is if we can actually move them at a faster pace, so that they actually have a chance to catch up. And it's just something that I see all the time, is slowing down for the kids who are struggling. No, we need to give them more opportunities, cram in more practice into a shorter period of time. Give them more opportunities to respond, more opportunities to practice, intensify that instruction, so they'll have a chance to catch up. I love this explanation. This came from a principal that I just think it's very powerful. She said that every minute in your school day matters. And the way she describes this really makes that clear. So think about your school day down to 2-minute chunks of time. Okay. 2 minutes every day for 180 days, which is the typical length of a school year, equals 360 minutes, or 6 hours, which is basically a full school day. So 2 minutes per day, every day, equals 1 whole day of school. So if you waste 2 minutes a day, you've lost a whole day of school, a whole day of learning. If your class lines up for a 10-minute bathroom break every day, you've used 5 days of school lining up for the bathroom. And if you think about it that way, it's just mind-blowing, right? That is such a powerful way to think about how easy it is to waste time during a school day. In contrast, for every 2 minutes of high-quality skills practice that you do each day, you've dedicated a whole day of instruction to those concepts. So we can either waste time or we can use time. And when you've got kids who are struggling in reading, they don't have the time to waste. You've got to get as much practice in as you possibly can to make it as effective as you can. So some things that you want to do for those kids who are struggling, who need more support. You need to think very carefully about how you're using the time and the resources that you have. So some of the things that you need to identify: who needs the review and remediation, who's going to provide it, what's the focus of that review and remediation, the format, and the time that's needed. Remember that our goal here is increasing opportunities to respond. So when we talk about who needs the review or remediation, you want to think about your progress monitoring assessment. You can think about which students are or are not meeting benchmarks. So your beginning of year, middle of year, end of year assessments give you that overall picture. But you also want to look more closely. Have the students learned what I just taught them today? Have they learned it yet? And if they haven't learned it, did you really teach it? Can you say that something has been taught if it hasn't also been learned? So you need to really pay close attention each day that you're teaching to make sure that kids are learning what you're teaching them. So that can be informally through teacher observation, or it can be a little bit more systematic with frequent assessment of skills. So you might be doing daily or weekly assessment to see, are kids moving along and learning what I want them to learn? So if I think about that, if I assess kids and I find that overall, I'm going to have to provide small group support for some kids, but how much am I going to need? So kids who score the lowest overall are the ones who are going to need the most intensive support. Other kids are going to need some support, but maybe not quite as intensive support. Some might just need a little tiny bit of review, and some kids aren't going to need any support at all. And if I'm doing frequent assessment, I can start honing in on which kids need how much support. Then I need to think about who's going to provide it. Well, we already talked about we want the most skilled instructor, right? The teacher with the most skills to provide that intensive support. But there are a lot of other people who can potentially provide extra support, to provide extra hands in the classroom. There might be a co-teacher if you're lucky. You might have a paraprofessional, maybe a student from a university or college, a volunteer, or even an older student. You're teaching kindergarten and your fourth graders come to help every now and then. All of those folks can be helpful, but we need to think about that flower shop lady. That's not who we want providing the intensive intervention for the child who's struggling the most. That needs to be the teacher, the best qualified individual to work with the students who are struggling the most. But you might be able to use those other folks to help as well. You want to make sure that the activities you provide for those other people to provide support, maybe somebody with less training or less knowledge about reading, is practice that they are going to be able to provide effectively. So one of the things we have, for example, on the toolbox that I mentioned, are little home practice sheets. We developed those specifically so that parents who probably don't have any formal training in reading instruction could learn how to do it. So there's a guide for how to do each of the activities on this home practice sheet. Well, it's designed for somebody without knowledge and extra skill. You can train somebody to do this in 5 minutes. This is something that would be very appropriate for a volunteer to do, or even an older child to work to do with the younger children. They can provide ongoing skill review after the review time with you. So if you have already called your most struggling students up for small group, they can go back and get extra practice with someone else that'll probably be more effective than them doing independent work. These other folks can listen to students as they read a decodable text. They might be able to review those heart words with them. So think just logically about what would be an appropriate type of practice for someone with less knowledge or experience in teaching reading to be doing with your students. You want to think about the instructional focus, what you're going to focus on. So in this example, you have totals, overall scores on an assessment, but you see there's multiple concepts that are being taught in that assessment. And if I just look at, say, all the kids that are in yellow, they all scored the same, 7. But if I look more closely, they didn't score the same overall. They need help on different things. So Andrea needs help on the first skill and the last skill, but she's doing fine on the skill in the middle. Where Damien needs help on the second and third skill, but he's doing fine on the first one. We wouldn't necessarily need to call this group of students up to work together on all of those skills because they don't all need help on those skills. And when we're talking about providing effective practice, we want to make sure that we're matching the skills and the practice that we provide with the needs of the students. We also want to think about what format we're providing this review and remediation in. Is it going to be small group? Are we going to get kids to practice with their partners? Or is it going to be independent practice? Thinking about that over the course of the week, based on your progress monitoring assessment, can be a really powerful way of focusing in on the things that kids need the most. So for example, instead of just saying, I'm going to pull each of my groups, they're going to be the same groups each week, and each of them, they're going to get the same amount of time. I've got half an hour and I've got 3 groups, so they're each going to get 10 minutes, or I've got an hour and they're each going to get 20 minutes. That makes no sense at all because they don't all need the same amount of support. Some kids might need 1 or 2 minutes, once or twice a week. Other kids might need 10 minutes, 4 or 5 days a week. And you need to pay attention to who needs what. Use your data to plan your instruction. Another way to provide practice is with workstations. So these need to be things that kids can do independently, but they can be really helpful ways to build both accuracy and automaticity with foundational skills. You want to use them to maximize the number of opportunities to respond. So you want to do things that kids have some degree of accuracy with already, and that they can improve their accuracy, but most of all, improve their automaticity. So that might be rereading a decodable text. It might be playing a game, practicing words that you know that they can spell or can read, just giving them more opportunities to do that. When you're using workstations, you want to make sure if the kids can work independently, that it's review content, not new content, that they know the expectations and routines to maximize the effectiveness of that workstation, that they know where they're supposed to be, and that they know how to use the materials. And you want to plan everything down to, especially with young kids, teaching them how to put the cap back on the marker and listen for the click, to make sure that you don't have to, throw away markers every day because they're dried out. So thinking about all of the different materials and the different methods that you're using and making sure kids know what to do, how to do it. For workstations, you can also make them more efficient by using a visible schedule, having brief rotations. So not having kids stay at a workstation so long that they get off task because they finish their activity. And then also know how to make transitions and how to do things quickly. The last piece of review and remediation is thinking about the time that you need. So again, thinking back to those groups, you might think about some kids needing 10 to 12 minutes every day. Other kids need fewer minutes and fewer days. Others, fewer minutes still and fewer days still. And some kids might not need small group, and that's okay. You want to make sure that the support you're providing matches their needs. And those needs may change from day to day, from week to week. So back to thinking about all of these elements of effective intervention: explicit, systematic, intensive, ample opportunities to respond, good monitoring, and feedback. All of these things, like I mentioned, you can find on the toolbox. I'm just going to show you a little bit about where. Again, it's ufliteracy.org. And if you scroll down on the front page, you will find the scope and sequence units or groups. And if you click on one of those bricks, it'll take you to a page that looks like this. And this is where you can find all sorts of materials. So you can find slide decks that go along with each skill. This is the kind of introduction I was showing you before, how to be very explicit in your introduction. You can find decodable passages that go along with each skill. You can find home practice activities. And then you can find practice activities. Right now we have roll and read activities. We're about to add some more games to that section. You also can, from the toolbox, from this little kind of tomato red box, find the apps. So there are ways to practice word work using the word work mats, or to practice automaticity with decoding using the blending board on the right. There are a ton of printable resources available for free. So heart word cards, grapheme cards. There's also a decodable text guide where you can find decodable text from a wide range of publishers that align with the different skills on our scope and sequence. If you have a different scope and sequence with your program, you can still find that skill and see where those skills are practiced with that particular publisher. We also have links to a lot of YouTube videos that provide additional practice for you to learn some of these strategies. So it is almost 8 o'clock. So I'm going to leave this the last couple of minutes for questions, if there are any. Larissa?
Thank you so much. I took so many notes tonight. I love that analogy that you used to highlight just the importance of who we're thinking about assigning to those most struggling readers for that practice. The flower shelf lady, that's going to stick with me for sure. I had a question here. It's actually from Cheryl. If we are using UFly during tier 1 or tier 2, can we also use UFly in tier 3 for the same student?
Absolutely. In fact, I find it's more helpful to use the same program, whatever program you're using, at the different tiers. I don't know where we got this idea that you have to use a different program for intervention than you use for tier 1 instruction. That really doesn't follow basic logic. The main thing to do to make a program appropriate for tier 2 or tier 3 is to make it more intensive. And we know that the way to make it more intensive is to provide more opportunities to respond. Now, I will say that some programs inherently offer more opportunities to respond than others. And so you'll want to make sure that whatever you're using does have that. But like Cheryl said, if you're using it for using UFly for tier 1 and tier 2, there's lots built in that provide that extra practice time. Even if you're going back and reviewing the same lesson again with kids who need really intensive intervention, but there are extra word chains, there's word lists, there's lots of different games that you can play. Those are all ways to provide more practice with those grapheme phoneme correspondences and the skills they need to read those words.
I love the simplicity of that home practice slide that you shared with that sheet. I think that's so helpful for families, but thinking about using that for volunteers or for additional practice opportunities in the classroom too. Yeah. What is the best way to progress monitor if you are using UFly? I know, like, thinking about progress monitoring being available within UFly, I would say traditional progress monitoring systems, but I'm guessing you would say UFly, you would use formative assessments from what you're teaching.
Yeah, so the way that we've built the progress monitoring into the Foundations program is that at the end of the week, you teach one concept on Monday and Tuesday, another concept on Wednesday and Thursday, and then on Friday, you review those two concepts, and then you assess. And the assessment is just a super quick spelling assessment. And we chose to incorporate spelling assessments for a couple of reasons. One, it's a lot faster to administer to your whole class. You can usually do your whole assessment of your whole class of students in 5 or 10 minutes, as opposed to pulling them up individually to have them decode words. But also, encoding is a really good measure of decoding. It's a nice little window into a child's decoding skills. It's very, very rare that a child can spell a word that they can't read, but it's very common that they can read a word that they can't spell. So by assessing their spelling, you're kind of assessing both at the same time, which is just a much more efficient way to do things. And if you can't tell by the way that I've talked tonight, we're all about efficiency, making the most of every minute.
Yeah, thank you. I loved all of the grouping sheets that you shared. You talked about flexible grouping a lot, and that's a really hard concept to really wrap our heads around when we are, in some of the typical literacy practices that we see, those same groups of students kind of stick together over time. But you really highlighted tonight how we can be flexible with those groups, thinking about the who and the what, looking at the skills across, across the different components, to seeing what they need the most practice with. So, even students who need the most practice may not need the same practice. So that was so helpful. I have a couple other great questions here. Thinking about this is the site I feel like has been floating around a lot with people that I'm working with, but as you are working with students in small groups, whether it's intervention, extra practice, tier 1, tier 2, what are some of the other students doing during that time, or how does this really look like in an ELA block?
Yeah. Well, one of the things that I really recommend is that as much time as you possibly can be teaching whole group. And we certainly want to differentiate and meet individual kids' needs, but it doesn't need to be a lot of your instructional time. Most of your instruction can actually be really efficiently taught via whole group. And then the kids who are not catching on as quickly can get more of that same skill practice in small group. When you're working with kids in small group, that's when you want to use your workstation. So you want to make sure that you are teaching kids very effectively how to use the workstations independently. You're making sure that the activities that you provide there are things that they can do independently, things that they've practiced before and just need additional interleave practice with. As much as possible, getting kids to learn how to do paired activities. It keeps them more engaged for longer, usually if they can work with a pair. If your kids are ready for that, not all kids are going to be able to stay on task that way, but often having a partner keeping them accountable will do that for them.
Great, thank you. Think kind of to piggyback on that, is choral reading of a story in a large group of first graders effective?
It can be very effective. And one of the things I didn't actually include this slide, I'm sorry. But one of the ways to do this is to have kids learn to do choral reading, to come in together is a big part of choral reading. And you can start by doing that just a little bit at a time. So let's say you're reading a sentence, the dog chased the cat. You can show them the whole sentence and say, what word? And they say the, right? Let's sound out this next word, dog. What do you have so far? The dog. Okay, and then you're doing it one word at a time, adding on, coming back and rereading. And so they're getting really good at repeated reading of that sentence, and they're able to stay together that way. And once you do that for a while, then you can have them read 2 or 3 words at a time before you go back to the beginning of the sentence. But you're practicing the choral response as much as you're practicing reading the words at first. And eventually they start getting really good at it. One of the things that often happens is that your struggling readers will come in half a beat behind your more capable readers. And that's actually okay. They're providing a model. They're getting the practice doing it. As long as they're coming in and it's not way after, I don't worry about it too much. They will start coming in together over time, but they might need a little bit more practice in doing it before they do that. But choral reading can be a really powerful practice. For kids who are not ready for that, you can do echo reading, you can do partner reading. There's other ways to do practice of reading text with different levels of scaffolding.
Mm-hmm. And it sounds like from all of those different ways, it's keeping them engaged in the work.
Right.
There's a question, can we use this with older students, 3rd to 8th grade?
If they need the skills that are on the scope and sequence, absolutely. There's really nothing in the program that's particularly babyish or juvenile. So we've seen it used with high school students and adults even without any problem. But the skills are the skills so that if they're beyond the skills that are in the scope and sequence, then it would not be appropriate. But if they still need work on those skills, then absolutely.
Are the actual assessments in the manual?
Yeah, it's they're just a super quick little progress monitoring assessment, that little spelling test that's at the end. The back of the manual has one for every lesson in it.
Awesome. Here's a question from Brooke. I'm an intervention teacher using UFly for 30 minutes a day with small groups of 1st and 2nd graders who are working significantly below grade level. Should I use the full lesson in my intervention, or should I focus on certain parts of the lesson?
In general, I would say use the whole lesson. The lesson is designed to be taught across 2 30-minute sessions. But there's really nothing in the lesson that I would skip. If you are working with intervention with older kids, there might be. So maybe they know all the irregular words already. You might not need to practice the irregular words that are in the lesson. But for the most part, I would do all of the lesson components.
Okay. I wanted to share my screen really fast before we, as we start to wrap up here. Now I get to the little bar I need to get to is covered up here. All right, well, it's not how I wanted it to look here, but just gonna have to live with that. I had one more question. Have you worked with schools who use EL for language comprehension and UFly for decoding? If yes, how have you found that those work together? While I know they're not directly related, I'm interested in feedback from those who've used both programs.
None of the schools we're directly working with in our partnerships are using EL, but I know there are schools out there that are doing it. And if you haven't visited our Facebook group, I would really strongly recommend that you do. It's called UFly Foundations Building Strong Reader, UFly Foundations Community Building Strong Readers. And there are definitely teachers in there that are using it. So you could ask questions of them and get really, it's just a wonderful community. You can get really good advice.
All right. Yeah, I was going to mention that has been, even if you're not a school that's using UFly right now, I think a lot of the discussions are really rich in that group and can just be really great learning opportunities, and just seeing what other schools and teachers are talking about. What they're asking about, I think, is always really just a helpful kind of nice thread to follow sometimes. And people share resources too, as they've adopted your materials and have started to use them in different ways in their classroom, whether it's tier 1 or tier 2. I think that's been really helpful too, as people start to work together and share different resources.
It's been amazing. And the teachers there are so supportive of each other. I just love it.
Yeah.
They're almost 100,000 members now. It's really growing like crazy.
I saw there was a post one day, somebody had printed off materials, and she was even just sharing how she was going to work with groups of teachers, training them for a morning. So, and just giving like the kind of her agenda for the day, like we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this, and then we're going to do this. Just, even just those kinds of tips I think are helpful. And I see you on there a lot, always answering and really engaging in the conversation too. So
I try.
Always so gracious with
in
your
my
time.
Spare time.
Yeah, I doubt you have much of that.
Not
No,
much.
but it's always so helpful to see what you're up to and the different conversations happening there. So that's a great resource as well. One more question, and I want to be respectful of your time. Some people asked, I know we were going to share the recording, but what about the slides? Somebody asked for some of those slides, or if we could post them in that UFly group, or maybe some of this. I think somebody was maybe specifically wanting to post some screenshots of some of the slides that they felt were really powerful.
Yeah, I think, I'm not going to share the slides themselves, but if you took screenshots and want to share those, feel free to share, just to get people to want to watch the recording. Absolutely.
Okay. That sounds great. Yeah, I thought there were some that were really powerful. The who and what, I love that. That really helped capture that idea of flexible grouping so well. So it was one of my favorites. Okay, well, thank you so much for coming on tonight and taking the time to just really talk through how to maximize those practice opportunities for students with foundational reading skills. And thank you for joining us. If you were here participating or listening, we hope to see you again soon.
Yes, thanks everybody.
Bye, Dr. Lane. Thank you so much.